John here from bootcamp.com. Welcome to another video. In today's lesson, we're going to be walking you through the dorsal column-medial lemniscal pathway, the different types of neurons involved, and the somatotopic organization that we see throughout. So if you want, you can pause and take a look at the outline, but let's just get started. So if you recall, the dorsal column is divided into two segments, the fasciculus gracilis and the fasciculus cuneatus. Our fasciculus gracilis, this is going to be found more medially. In the fasciculus cuneatus, this is going to be found just lateral to that. Now remember, the dorsal column-medial lemniscal pathway, the DCML, this is carrying types of information that has to do with discriminative touch, vibration, and proprioception, as well as pressure. So all this information is organized in these two pathways, which are found bilaterally. Now, the fasciculus gracilis, this is going to be carrying that type of information coming from the lower limb. And a way that you can remember that is that fasciculus gracilis actually has an L in gracilis. So gracilis, or that L in gracilis, stands for lower limb. Whereas in fasciculus cuneatus, we have a U in there. So this can represent upper limb. Because the cuneatus, this is going to carry information coming from the upper limb. So like we previously mentioned, the dorsal column is organized by three neurons. We have a first order, second order, and third order neuron. The first order neuron, that's going to be the one in the peripheral nervous system actually picking up the sensation, travels through the dorsal column, where it's going to go up to the medulla and synapse. On the second order neuron in either the nucleus gracilis or the nucleus cuneatus. At this point, that second order neuron then decussates and then heads superiorly up through that medial lemniscal pathway to our thalamus, where it's going to synapse on a third order neuron in the ventral posterior lateral aspect of the thalamus. That cell is then going to send its axon to the somatosensory cortex. So let's look at these pathways broken down by upper limb and lower limb. Now, starting by looking at the dorsal column pathway for lower limbs, these again are going to travel through our fasciculus gracilis. Remember, L in gracilis stands for lower limb. The cell body for these are going to be found in the dorsal root ganglion, and the dendrites are what are actually picking up the signal, and the axon is what is going to be sent up the fasciculus gracilis all the way up to the level of the brainstem, where it synapses at the nucleus gracilis. So you can see first order neuron comes in, travels up our fasciculus gracilis right here, and then heads up to the brainstem. So this travels the entire length of the spinal cord. Let's say you're starting in the sacral or lumbar region. It's going to travel the entire way up the spinal cord to the medulla of the brainstem, where it's going to synapse on our second order neuron, which is going to be found in our nucleus gracilis right here. At this point, that second order neuron decussates or crosses over the midline and travels through the medial lemniscal system. These two structures right here, these are representing that medial lemniscal system. It's then going to ascend superiorly until it reaches the point of the thalamus, known as the ventral posterior lateral aspect of the thalamus right here. From here, it's then going to synapse on a third order neuron found in that ventral posterior lateral aspect of the thalamus, and this neuron's axon will send that signal to the primary somatosensory cortex, where that sensation can then be perceived. So going over it one more time, first order neuron comes in, travels up our fasciculus gracilis, the entire length of the spinal cord, all the way up to the medulla of the brainstem, synapses on the nucleus gracilis, where the second order neuron is going to be found. From here, it crosses over or decussates and travels superiorly through our medial lemniscal pathway all the way up to the thalamus, to the ventral posterior lateral aspect of the thalamus, where it synapses on our third order neuron, which then sends that signal to the primary somatosensory cortex. Now let's take a look at the dorsal column system for an upper limb pathway. So this is going to be very similar, except for the fact that it's going to travel up our fasciculus cuneatus. So our first order neuron, like we saw in the previous pathway, is going to be found, the cell body will be found in that dorsal root ganglion again. The dendrites are what are picking up the signal, and it's going to enter into the spinal cord via those dorsal roots. And now it's going to travel superiorly or ascend the spinal cord in our fasciculus cuneatus. From here, it then synapses again on that second order neuron, except this time it's going to be found in the nucleus cuneatus, not the nucleus gracilis like we saw from the lower limb. So if the axon is traveling up the fasciculus cuneatus, it's going to synapse in the nucleus cuneatus on the second order neuron. From here, the axon from our second order neuron will then decussate or cross over and enter into our medial lemniscal system. It's then going to travel superiorly up through this medial lemniscal pathway up to the thalamus again, where it's going to synapse on the third order neuron in the ventral posterior lateral aspect of our thalamus. And then from here, that third order neuron will send its axon to the appropriate portion of the somatosensory cortex. Now, what would happen if we had a lesion along this pathway? Let's say we have a lesion right here. What sort of effects would we see? Let's say that this is going to be the right side of the brain. If we have a lesion right here, we're not receiving information from the left side of the body. So we would have a loss of discriminative touch, vibration and pressure, and proprioception on the left upper limb. This would be a contralateral loss of function. Whereas if we had a lesion right here on that first order neuron, then we would have an ipsilateral loss of function. So we would have a loss of discriminative touch, vibration, pressure, and proprioception on the left side of the body, the ipsilateral side of the lesion. Now, what if we had a lesion in our nucleus cuneatus? In that case, we would also see an ipsilateral effect because this portion, the nucleus cuneatus, is the portion before the point of decussation. So if the lesion is on the left nucleus cuneatus, we're also going to see left sensory deficits in our patient. So that's going to be ipsilateral. If it was here, then we would see contralateral sensory deficits. Now, there's something interesting that we need to consider when we're looking at the dorsal column. It has a specific somatotopic organization, and we briefly touched upon this in the sense that the fasciculus gracilis carries information from the lower limb, and the fasciculus cuneatus will carry information from the upper limb. But it's actually a little bit more structured than that. Starting medially, this is where we're going to carry information from the sacral and coccygeal spinal nerves. As we move one column over, we're still in the fasciculus gracilis, but this little section, this will carry information from the lumbar spinal nerves. And then we have our thoracic section right here, as well as our cervical section right here. So as you ascend the dorsal column, more and more axons are being added to that dorsal column depending on what level we are at. So starting with the fasciculus gracilis, this is coming from the lower body, which is going to be our lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal regions. And then you end up adding the thoracic and cervical regions to our fasciculus cuneatus as we move up the body. So more and more dermatome levels are being added to our dorsal column as we ascend the spinal cord. So understanding the somatotopic organization of the dorsal column, what would you expect if you had a slow-growing intramedullary lesion found towards the midline of the dorsal column? Let's say it's found towards the midline and it's slowly growing laterally. What sort of deficits would you see in a patient? Well, first we need to remember that the dorsal column is only responsible for discriminative touch, pressure and vibration, and proprioception. So we would start seeing a loss in these sensations beginning in the sacral and coccygeal region. And then as the tumor grows, it's then going to take over the lumbar region. We would then see a loss of sensation in our thoracic and trunk region as it moves laterally. And then finally, you would lose sensation, or you would start to see a loss in sensation in the cervical region as we move And as the tumor grows more laterally and compresses more of the spinal cord, you begin to see a loss in your upper limbs. So understanding the somatotopic organization of the dorsal column is very important for understanding the progression of a lesion over time and what sort of sensory deficits would begin to accumulate as the lesion starts to grow larger. But anyways, that's all we have for the dorsal column. Here's some references for some images we used. I hope you enjoyed that. We talked about the dorsal column-medial lemniscal pathways for the upper and lower limb and looked at the different neurons involved in each of them. We also looked at the somatotopic organization of the dorsal column. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll see you all in the next one.